we're the chairs of the IOP's policy group, zooming in from Kentucky and California, respectively. Welcome to our third week of FAST Forums, our new series for conversations with prominent public figures, including elected officials, journalists, and activists.
While we cannot join together in person, technology allows us to convene virtually, and bringing FAST Forums online allows us to share Harvard University's premier arena for political speech, discussion, and debate across many states and countries, while we are remote for the remainder of the semester.
Now, please join us in welcoming our moderator and IOP Senior Fellow, Dan Balz.
Thank you both. Welcome everyone who's tuning in. Thank you for joining us for this week. As mentioned, we're doing these every Thursday night at 6 o'clock. We are off to a great start. We've had two great ones, and we've got a wonderful guest tonight. We appreciate all the interest that you who are tuning in have shown, and we hope you continue to join us every Thursday night. I'm thrilled to have as our guest tonight Lena Sun, who covers health issues at the Washington Post with a specialty in public health and infectious disease. We could not have a more timely guest tonight, given everything that is going on. Not quite as long as I have been, but a good long time. And we've been colleagues for and had a lot of fun together. Among other things, she was the Beijing bureau chief for the Post, and in 2002 was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the war on terror. She's a tenacious reporter, and as I say, a wonderful colleague. I'm going to start out with a few questions for Lena, and then I will turn it over to all of you because we really appreciate the questions from the students. I will get out of the way. Just remember that when you're queued up to introduce yourself, keep your question as succinct as possible because we have a limited amount of time, obviously, with these. And make sure under the IOP rules that the question ends with a question mark. So with that, let me start off. Lena, again, welcome. Thank you for doing this. I think it would be great if you could just tell people a little bit about yourself. Did you always want to be a journalist? Did you always look to be a health journalist? How did you get from where you started to where you are today?
Well, actually, in high school, I really wanted to be a doctor, probably because I had a crush on my biology teacher. And so I went to college thinking I might be pre-med. Then I discovered that I was not very fond of the people who were around me who were on that track. And I also discovered that organic chemistry was going to be a killer. So I decided not to take that route. And in my last year in college, junior year in college, I had a chance to go overseas. This was a long time before there were a lot of students in China. And I lived in China as a student for a year. And I was struck by the stereotypes that Chinese had about Americans. They thought literally that the streets were paved with gold. And when I actually took out a needle and thread to sew a button on a shirt, they were shocked because they heard that everybody in America was rich and had servants. Then, of course, when I came back to the US, people thought that everybody in China was, they all were blue ants and rode bicycles and couldn't think for themselves. So long story short, I thought I would go into journalism to sort of bridge this chasm of perception. That's really what got me started.
How did you make the transition to health reporting?
I always wanted to be a doctor, and I thought this would be sort of my way of getting at it without having to go to medical school or take organic chemistry.
Excellent. So give us the backstory on how you got into this story about the coronavirus. You co-wrote the first piece in the Post, which was, I believe, the first week of January of this year. Yes. Tell us how you got onto this and where it took you.
So at the end of the year, I started noticing, the health reporters tend to monitor lots of Twitter feeds, and there started to be some traffic about this mysterious illness that was developing in China, pneumonia-like illness. And I noticed it, and I had some email exchange with my colleagues in Beijing. because, we didn't know if it was going to happen, if it would be the infectious disease person, the health side that would take the lead, or the Beijing reporters, because they have the dateline. And we emailed back and forth, and Anna Fifield and she was monitoring. I wanted to make sure she was watching it, and she had been watching it because there was more of it in the Chinese Twitters, or the equivalent of the Chinese Twitters. And as it started to develop, she turned it over to her colleague, Jerry Shi, and we decided we would write something together because I was beginning to get information from here in the US. And then it quickly snowballed because then the Chinese officially talked about it. They sequenced the genome of this new virus, and the cases started to spread in China. The WHO began to be very involved. And over here, as you remember, Dan, back in those days, we couldn't get much attention for these stories because of impeachment and politics. And I remember when I would be sending out emails asking for people to share the stories, we would ask, counter-programming note, not a political story, not an impeachment story about a virus. Then, of course, as things started to hit the United States, as it always happens, the attention immediately shifted, and all of a sudden there was a lot more interest in the story.
But it took a little while for that to happen, obviously. And as somebody who was on the front line on this story, did you have a clear sense of how rapidly this could spread and how devastating it could become?
I think it hit us that weekend in February when you started to see cases surge in Italy and you started to see all those deaths in Iran. And that was the weekend before Nancy Messonnier from the CDC went during her briefing. It was a Tuesday briefing, I remember, where she struck a much different tone and said that she talked to her children at the breakfast table and people needed to be prepared for lives to be disrupted. It was the hair on fire briefing. And that was when Trump was not yet back in the US. I guess he was on his way back from India, and things blew up and the White House freaked out. But when she started to change her tone in that briefing, several of us who were listening to the briefing, we all, sat up, started to wave to our editors like, hold on, we need to file something right now, because it was because of the numbers had up so rapidly.
Yeah. What is your routine like now? I mean, we're all working remotely, which, journalists are used to working in odd places and with difficult conditions. You're sitting right now in our Rockville bureau, which you have commandeered as an extra workspace. But what is the reporting like, and how much more challenging is it now that it's become a huge story, but also B, in which you're not together with everybody in the newsroom?
It is really, really difficult because the demand is so much greater. Stories that we used to maybe think we had several days to do, we now are often trying to turn them around in hours. And the only way we can do that is by teaming up with other reporters. So we have a health science team, and it is very rare that you will see just one solo byline, because people are reporting at the same time, or somebody might start reporting a story and the other person will start writing. And the problem is that it's challenging because the situation is so fluid and the news is changing from hour to hour. And the developments are so fast. And probably the biggest challenge now is the way the White House is trying to control the message. So instead of a public health agency like the CDC giving regular briefings with data and science, you are getting bits and pieces of it during the White House briefing, which can go for 2 hours and which Trump can basically commandeer and talk about everything but the science. And so it is very frustrating as a reporter to try to find out what is happening. And because the White House is controlling so much of the message, the agencies that do the public health work are muzzled, and you can't get to them.
the mask, I want to ask about one thing, which it seems like it's become, in many ways, a generic problem, which is confusing advice. I mean, part of it, you've noted the White House briefings, which the President of the United States has said all kinds of things, some true, some very much not true. But the scientists, the science side of this has also not always been consistent. And the most obvious recent example is with whether people, ordinary people who don't have any symptoms and don't feel sick, should wear a mask when they're out in public. For a while it was, no, you should not wear a mask. Now it is, yes, you should wear a mask. What's happening on that front, and how do you explain a dramatic 180-degree shift on something that seems pretty basic?
Well, two things. First of all, remember that this is a totally new virus. So they don't have, and nobody has any sort of experience or background to know what it's likely to do or how it's likely to behave. It's a new virus. It doesn't really know what it wants to be when it grows up. And so initially, they did not recommend wearing masks because they did not think that this virus could be transmitted asymptomatically. In other words, that you could transmit it without showing symptoms. Since then, there has been more science, and this is because the science is changing, which is why it seems so confusing. The guidelines have to evolve with the science. And when they discovered that there was more transmission when somebody is not showing symptoms, they felt like this was a better guideline to recommend for people, and also people were doing it. And so they wanted to have some guidance on this. Of course, the interesting part is the White House did not want to put this in effect purely for political reasons. And so something that was fairly straightforward based on the science took more than a week to get basically put out to the public. And it changed back and forth. And it was a big fight between the White House political advisors and the scientists.
Yeah, good. I'm going to now turn it over to students. And Reed, you are the first person to raise a question for Lena. Go ahead, please.
Great. Lena, thank you so much for joining us. First off, I'm Reed. I am a senior at the college. I'm also the chair of the Women's Initiative in Leadership at the IOP, also zooming in from New York City, so pretty crazy times right now. I'm curious to hear from you. About 2 weeks ago, we had an issue here with Mount Sinai and New York Presbyterian shutting down their delivery rooms for women who were giving birth. So there was about a week here where, as I'm sure you heard, women were giving birth alone. And then Cuomo obviously stepped in and stopped that. I'm sort of curious to hear from you how you navigate that delicate balance between obviously taking care of people, making sure they're safe, not putting healthcare workers at risk, but also supporting people who do have to go in for procedures, and whether you think it was right that Cuomo stepped in that case.
I'm not quite sure what your question was. How do I navigate the balance? I mean, I'm not navigating a balance.
No. I mean, how healthcare workers should navigate that balance, or should I say administrators at hospitals, making sure they're.
I mean, I think that is a real big issue that has come up in our reporting. You see healthcare workers who are talking about not having enough PPE, personal protective equipment, and getting fired for speaking out. You see, I think in a lot of places, the hospitals are really looking at their liability, and they don't want to get sued. But the really strong leaders have been the ones who have been really supportive of their staff. But at the same time, I think you're seeing this tension play out. The hospitals are, because of coronavirus, they are stopping a lot of elective surgeries, right? That is where they make their money. And if they can't make their money there, they are losing money. And in some cases, hospitals are having to lay off staff. I mean, I think it really comes down to the leadership of individual hospitals. And there is that tension also between what the hospitals can do for their people, and what the governor needs to do to make sure the greater public is protected.
Okay, thank you, Reed. Next up is Shruti.
Hello. Hi, Lena. Thank you for joining us. My question goes back to something that you mentioned earlier when you were discussing reporting on this, about information coming from the Trump administration and how it isn't always accurate and can also incite a lot of fear within the public as well. So I'd love to hear your take on the role of news organizations in mediating that, and whether they should be live streaming it, whether they should be doing additional measures to fact check if they are going to be live streaming, and just the responsibility that news organizations need to hold to ensure that public is receiving accurate information, but that also public officials are getting their time to communicate to the public.
I think it's a big difficulty for us, and Dan can jump in here too, because you see this all the time in politics. But I find it very hard to watch some of these briefings because because Trump is so economical with the truth. Mm-hmm. And you see, we are here in an unprecedented public health crisis, and he is going tit for tat with reporters about, does this state have 300 ventilators, and I sent this. It is not, in my mind, how a leader should be presenting himself. Whether on our site, Dan, I think we stream it every day, right?
I think so, but I don't know the answer to that. I think we have generally streamed it every day.
We usually stream it, but I noticed that CNN and some of the other cable networks, they start and then they cut away because, first of all, they ramble on for 2 hours. On this issue of should we be giving him a platform? Unfortunately, right now, all of the information about the virus and the response is really only available from the coronavirus task force. And it is frustrating for me because that is something that is the bailiwick of our political folks. So we don't get to ask the scientific questions. We're not in the room. And so what we try to do best is to truth squad that in real time. Yesterday, for example, he was going on and on about hydroxychloroquine and the importance of that. And then he started talking about zinc. And I immediately tweeted out something that was a link to one of the stories we have done about zinc and how taking vitamins is not something you want to do. It's not a way to completely boost your immune system. So you try to do the best you can. And for things that, you see our political coverage every couple of days, sort of truth squad an aspect and turn it around and explain what's going on and why he's doing the things he's doing. It's hard, though. It's very hard.
I would only add to that, and I think Lena's absolutely right. I would refer people to today's Wall Street Journal. Their editorial page did an editorial basically saying it's time to end these briefings, in part because they say there's very little real information that's coming at this point, and only in the last few minutes when Vice President Pence gets to the microphone. And so they're feeling, and they're certainly, they've been more friendly to the president than some other news organizations. So that's an indication, I think, of kind of the public tiring of what, as Lena says, is a very, very long show every night. So thank you, Shruti. Next is Diego.
Hello, Dan. Lena, thank you both for joining us. My name is Diego Garcia. I'm a senior at the college from the Northern Virginia area. So I'm a local supporter of the Washington Post.
Great.
I just wanted to ask, I'm curious, in mid-March, the Chinese government essentially expelled a lot of American journalists, including from the Washington Post. And I'd like to know what the plan is to continue being able to get news from China, like what the Washington Post plan is, and how long do you think this move is going to last, and when the Washington Post and other American publications might be able to get their journalists back in country?
Well, they expelled one of the two correspondents we have there. Anna Fifield is still there, but Jerry Shi had to leave. I believe Jerry is currently, he's still in the area. He's in Asia. And he's still writing stories. He wrote a very poignant story the other day about all the things that people in Wuhan are doing to pay tribute to that doctor. It was a very moving story. I'm not on the foreign desk, but I'm sure Doug Gell, our foreign editor, is doing everything possible to get him reaccredited or get someone else there. When I was in China as a correspondent, I had some run-ins with the police, and they chose not to renew my journalist visa. They wouldn't even extend it for a week. And, you know, we had to leave when they wanted us to leave. And then as punishment, this is how the Chinese operate, as punishment, the next correspondent, it took forever to get the next correspondent accredited. And in the end, that correspondent that the Washington Post wanted to send could not get his accreditation. He had to basically cool his heels in Hong Kong. And then he eventually left the Washington Post to go work for the New York Times in Moscow. So this is the way the Chinese, you know, people talk about how China has opened up. It's a huge economy. Everything is booming. Certain things don't change about the way they operate. You know, it's basically a dictatorship, right? So the Washington Post is going to keep trying. And, you know, Jerry will continue to report from where he can.
Thank you, Diego. Great to see you. Be well. Carson, you're up next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you both so much for your time and for speaking with us. I'm Carson. I'm a freshman at the college. I wanted to ask, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty right now, like shortages of medical supplies, frustrations with how our leaders are responding to this, and obviously we don't even know how this pandemic is going to go in the long run. Based on what you've seen from your reporting, is there anything that gives you hope about our current situation, whether it relates to journalism or just in general?
You know, I was listening to the CDC director, Robert Redfield, talk about this in some radio interviews he gave. And he said that initially, you know, they talk, you know, you seem to talk about the curve and the models and the death projections. And he said he was surprised because when they did those models, and as you know, models are all based on assumptions, they had assumed that only 50% of people would pay attention to the rules. But there is now evidence that's come out in some of the other states where they've had the outbreak for longer, like in Washington state, where you really see in the curve where it's really gone down because social distancing has worked. You know, when people pull together and do this, that is really the best way, because the virus has to go from me to you. But if you are not close enough to me, it cannot get there. And in countries like South Korea and in Singapore and elsewhere in Asia, where there's a much stronger social fabric and there's much greater trust in the government, and people, when they're told stay home and they stay home, you see the evidence, and you don't see the deaths like you do here in Singapore. They have this incredible public health system, but of course, their police force is also finding people who are not social distancing. Yeah, I don't think we'd get away with that here, but I guess the little glimmer of hope would be if people are really listening and thinking about this and just hang in there, that will make a difference. But the fallacy is the administration is talking about April 30th, this date, and, you know, people raising false expectations that everything will be okay. It is not the date, it is the data. And if the data is not there, people should not go out, because you don't want to have a second wave or third wave of this stuff. You want to be able to have your classes in the fall in school, right?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Carson. Up next is Lena.
Hi, I'm Mina. I'm a junior at the college. Hi, Dan. Nice to see you again. Thank you so much, Lena, for being here. My question is specifically about reporting on coronavirus. As an Asian American, we've seen a lot of Asian American reporters say that they've faced direct instances of racism. This includes Wei Zhang from CBS and Kyung La from CNN. They said that they've experienced people calling it the Kung flu, including White House officials. My question is, in what ways do you think that being of Asian American descent may complicate coverage of the coronavirus? How does that, if at all, or if you're comfortable sharing, how has that kind of influenced the way you cover this and the way the American public perceives this?
I can tell you that I try to do as if there are requests for television, you know, for visual sort of interviews. We do a lot of radio interviews. But if there are TV interviews, I try to do them if I can, if I'm not on deadline, because I think it's important for people out there to see, oh, look, there is somebody who looks Asian, who is a reporter covering this. She is like a science person, to sort of help deal with the sort of the racist angle. On the other hand, when you have someone in the White House who is so inflammatory in what he says, that the other day, before we were working remotely, I was leaving the Washington Post. It's downtown Washington, and I was crossing the street, and a SUV came barreling around the corner, even though I had the green light. And I gave him this, just hand, stop. And he rolled down his window and he yelled an epithet at me, something I have not heard since I was in junior high. And so that is very hurtful and disheartening to me, which makes me want to do my job even more. So I think it's important, and we have many Asian American journalists in the newsroom on the health science team. There's me, there's Ariana, there's Carolyn. I think it's really important, and it really pisses me off when he keeps talking about it as the Chinese virus. It is so offensive.
Good, thank you. Mina, great to see you. Be well. We are nearly out of time. We have time for one more question, and that's from Kathy. Go ahead, Kathy. Welcome.
Hi, Lena. Hi, Dan. Thank you so much. I'm a student also at the college, and I'm the chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project. My question has to do with the flow of information that you noticed while you were in China. So I was wondering if you picked up on any effort by the central government in China to kind of suppress local reports of the coronavirus when they first came out. I know there are conceptions of people thinking authoritarian regimes tend to be more efficient in responding to crisis management. But I was wondering if you noticed that there were local incentives, or it seemed like information asymmetry was a particular problem in this case. It really exacerbated this crisis.
We know from our reporting, one of the first stories we did back in January was looking at the information that was coming out of Wuhan. Wuhan had all these cases of coronavirus, but the Communist Party, local leaders were encouraging people to go to like a sort of big gathering picnic where people could have been spreading this, which in my view is a big, huge public health bad on them. And we did a long sort of reconstruction where it showed that a lot of officials knew about this, but they didn't talk about it at the meetings, and they didn't give any kind of notice to the completely innocent and vulnerable people who were going out to these mass gatherings. So yes, that did take place.
Great. Kathy, thank you very much. Lena, any final thoughts on that you want to leave with the students about what it's been like to cover this? Any advice or thoughts?
Well, I just hope that everybody does what they're supposed to do so we can try to break the back of this thing and get life back to slightly more normal. It's never going to go back to the way it was. And I'm sorry that for your generation, I think this is going to be one of those defining moments of your lifetime, because there has never been anything like this. And I really hope that that the long-term impact is mitigated for you as you move on in your careers.
I would second that. Lena, thanks so much for participating tonight. I know you've been incredibly busy, so we're all grateful. And thank you to everybody who was watching and participating, those who asked questions and those who were not able to get questions in. But please come back next week, next Thursday night at 6 p.m., and we will have another Fast Forum for you. In the meantime, stay safe and be well. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.